Well, let's get some more analysis on this. Andreas Krieg joins me now from Doha. He's a professor of defense at King's College. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, the fight for Mosul has been going on now for 3 weeks to the date. Now, with Operation Euphrates Wrath, the fight for Raqqa, Daesh's de facto capital has started. If these operations are successful for the coalition forces, what state will it leave Daesh in?
Very good question. It seemed, we're all taken by surprise how effective the operations and how swift the advance has been so far in Mosul. I think a lot of people have expected this to take even longer, but we should not be too hasty to say that we're actually on a good way in Mosul to liberate the city. We're still in the outskirts. I think it's the closer we get to the city center, the more fierce the battle will become. And even then, we still don't know how many people are left out in Mosul. And then there's Raqqa. Obviously, it will be a two-front war. The question is, if we look at Raqqa, is how many ISIS people will stick out there, and how long will they actually be able to stick out? The question is then, looking forward, how long is this battle going on for? I think even if ISIS withdraws, and they might leave Mosul, they might leave Raqqa to move to the desert to regroup, even if that's going to happen, which will take months, I think even then ISIS will not be dead. But I think the key point here is, if Mosul and Raqqa fall 6 months from now or even longer, depending on how long the battle takes, the Islamic State as a quasi-state entity, as an administrative body, will collapse. So ISIS will then be purely a terrorist organization. They will not be an insurgency group anymore, because they will not be able to provide public goods and security to the people who live in their territory, because Raqqa is the administrative hub for ISIS.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. Now, the U.S. regards the SDF as the most effective force in northern Syria, but on the other hand, Turkey says they will not tolerate any joint action with the YPG, which basically makes up most of the SDF. Are these complicated relations potentially a more difficult problem than the one in Iraq?
Absolutely. I think this is a very precarious relationship. It's a very tight walk to be done by the Americans, because, as you correctly say, the SDF, and the biggest component of it is the YPG, have been the most important surrogate for the Americans. And America's war against ISIS is entirely a surrogate war. It's a war by proxy, whereby local forces are being trained and equipped to fight for American interests on the ground. So there is no way that the Americans will further their objectives in Syria or Iraq, which is to obviously defeat ISIS, without these surrogates on the ground. At the same time, Turkey is, as a NATO ally, is pursuing a slightly different agenda towards the West. Was mentioned in the reporting before that they wanted to take Al-Bab. This is all very important. So they have to provide a common cohesive front against ISIS. And at the moment they're both working towards the same objective, which is to push ISIS back and retake Raqqa. The question then is, what happens after Raqqa falls? What happens after Mosul falls? But most importantly, what happens after Raqqa falls and you're trying to repopulate these areas and try to build an administrative body, which will obviously not be the Assad government? Who is going to administer that territory? Is it going to be the SDF? Is it going to be the YPG? And I think this is where the main problem will lie, because Turkey will not accept the YPG or other Kurdish forces which are part of the SDF, to administer a territory just south of its border and create a safe haven for potential terrorist activities by the PKK.
Fair point. Okay. Now, effectively, you have two battles going on, two operations. If you could briefly compare these operations, I know it's a very difficult task to do in a short time, but the operation for the de facto capital in Raqqa, and as well as the largest stronghold of Daesh in Iraq, which is a city of over 1 million people.
Yes, and that's exactly where the difference is. Mosul is a massive metropolis, one of the biggest cities in the region, 1.5 million. You have loads of civilians still left out there, and very few ISIS people who can move around quite quickly in a tunnel system. They move from one civilian dwelling to the next. They fire snipers and mortars from civilian environments. The same will happen in Raqqa, obviously, but Raqqa is a smaller city. Raqqa has roughly 200,000 people living there, and maybe even less. A lot of the civilians will have fled by the time, because it's such a small city, by the time that the opposition will arrive. And so there will be still civilians in this fighting, but it will be Raqqa is effectively just a stronghold of ISIS. It is a bunker, it's a fortified bunker for ISIS, which will be a purely military task to destroy, while Mosul is a civilian city with some ISIS people in there, but mostly civilians who you cannot strike. So it makes the operation of actually taking Mosul a lot more complex than taking Raqqa. But when we come to Raqqa, until we get to Raqqa, we actually have to liberate all these villages around Raqqa, which will take months to do. In Mosul, we're already in the city, and obviously that is a very, very fierce battle to fight if you're trying to save your own people, your own troops, and most importantly, save also civilians at the same time. It's almost an impossible task.
Okay, Professor Andreas Krieg, we thank you very much for that analysis.